She was only 8. But what she whispered would unravel a secret so dangerous it could destroy everything a billionaire heiress had built, starting with her engagement. He was a quiet, single dad, just trying to raise his newly adopted daughter in peace. But when she leaned in and said, "There's a camera in your office," everything changed. What followed wasn't just about uncovering betrayal. It was about courage, second chances, and the quiet miracle that happens when someone finally chooses to listen. If you believe in stories that heal, that stir something deep in your soul, then this one's for you. Make sure to subscribe and tap the bell so you never miss the next story that could stay with you for life. Now, let me take you to the moment that little girl whispered the truth. New Orleans in February was a kaleidoscope of color music and masks, especially during Mardi Gras. Beneath the shimmering beads and rhythmic drums, the city pulsed with life. But for Dean Holloway, the celebration was more noise than joy. He stood off to the side of Jackson Square, volunteer badge pinned crookedly on his jacket, a garbage grabber in one hand, and a weary expression on his face. His flannel shirt damp with sweat, and mist clung to his back, and he could feel the weight of the past years bearing down like the gray clouds above. A jazz float rolled by, spilling brass and laughter into the crowd. Dean was scanning the crowd absently when he noticed her, the little girl standing far too close to the edge of the viewing platform. She couldn't have been more than 8. Blonde hair braided tight. An oversized coat swallowed her frame. She looked like she was searching for someone, maybe calling out, but no one seemed to notice. Then it happened. A sudden jolt in the crowd. A surge forward. A group of teens laughing too hard shoved toward the barrier. The little girl lost her footing, tumbled sideways, and disappeared through the gap under the bleachers. "Hey!" Dean shouted, already moving. He dropped the grabber and sprinted toward the edge. People didn't register what had happened until he was already there. He dropped to his knees and shoved his shoulder into the narrow opening beneath the stage platform, just in time to see her caught beneath a support beam, struggling to crawl backward, her leg pinned beneath her. Above them, the parade float was rolling forward. A fully loaded speaker rig mounted on steel wheels followed inches behind. Dean didn't think. He didn't hesitate. He dove in headfirst, scraping his arms and chest against the concrete as he dragged his way toward her. "Hold on," he gasped. "I've got you." The float was so close now the thunder of bass seemed to shake the earth. He wrapped his arms around her small torso and rolled hard to the side, just as the wheel passed where her head had been a heartbeat earlier. For a few moments, there was only the pounding of music and the faint scent of oil and metal. Then breath. Her breath. And his. "You okay, Dean?" asked, voice hoarse. She nodded. Her lip quivered, but she didn't cry. Instead, she leaned in close, pressing her lips near his ear, and whispered, "There's a camera. In her office. It's blinking red. All the time." Dean froze. It was an answer to a question no one had asked. "What do you mean?" he asked, pulling back slightly to look at her. But the girl only blinked and shook her head like she hadn't said anything at all. By the time paramedics arrived and led her off for a checkup, Dean stood behind, puzzled and scraped, watching her disappear into the crowd with a social worker. He didn't know it yet, but that little whisper would be the first crack in the wall he'd built around his life. 3 hours later, Dean stood in front of a small white house, tucked just a few blocks away from the French Market. A swing creaked in the breeze. The porch light flickered once he then steadied. Inside, Vivian Drake was plating dinner. Her auburn hair was twisted into an elegant low knot. She looked up when he stepped in, smile soft and ready. "You look like you got trampled by a marching band," she said, setting the plates down. Dean rubbed the back of his neck. "You're not far off." Vivian walked over, ran a thumb gently across the scrape on his cheek. "Volunteering is supposed to keep you safe, not send you home looking like a linebacker." There was a kid. She fell under a float. Vivian blinked. Oh my God. Is she all right? Yeah. Fine. Just strange thing. He didn't elaborate, but her eyes narrowed slightly. She was always tuned into undercurrents. She said something. When I pulled her out, Dean said carefully. Something about a blinking camera in her office. Vivian smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Kids say wild things. You know how they are. Dean nodded, but a flicker of something stirred. He didn't tell her that the way the girl had whispered it felt deliberate, like a warning, not a child's rambling. He took his plate to the dining table and sat. Vivian joined him, pouring wine into her glass. Speaking of offices, I talked with a few of my old contacts today. There's an investor interested in your old algorithm. Might be the break we need. Dean stabbed a piece of chicken. I told you I'm done with all that. I know. But Dean, this could give Maisie a real future. You've been trying to adopt her for months. Judges want financial stability. This is it. Maisie. The name sent a ripple through him. That little girl, the one he'd pulled out from under the float. He hadn't told Vivian yet that she was coming to stay with them, at least temporarily. The placement agency had called just yesterday, said they had no one else, that she needed someone stable, someone calm. And he had said, yes. He glanced up at Vivian. There were things he loved about her. Her energy, her competence, her unwavering charm. But sometimes, just sometimes, there were moments like now when he couldn't tell what was behind her eyes. And that whisper, it wouldn't leave him. Maisie Ray didn't say much the first night she arrived at Dean Holloway's house. The rain had started to fall in a light, steady rhythm as the caseworker, a tired woman in her late 40s, named Ms. Delaney, walked the little girl up the front steps. Dean opened the door with a hesitant smile, stepping aside to let them in. Maisie clutched a faded blue backpack to her chest and looked up at him with eyes far too old for 8 years. This is temporary, Delaney said gently, though her voice was clipped with exhaustion. A few weeks until we find something permanent. But she needs somewhere quiet, somewhere safe. Dean nodded. He didn't say he wasn't sure he was ready. He didn't say that quiet and safe felt like words from someone who didn't really believe they existed. Maisie stepped past him into the living room, eyes scanning everything. Bookshelf, fireplace, a dusty piano in the corner, the table with mismatched chairs. She didn't ask questions. She didn't complain. She just stood there like a guest, unsure if she was allowed to breathe. You can leave your backpack there, Dean offered, gesturing to the couch. She didn't move. I'll check in tomorrow, Ms. Delaney said, already halfway back to her car. Thank you, Mr. Holloway. Dean turned back toward Maisie, who was now staring at the piano like it held some kind of secret. He cleared his throat. You play, she shook her head. Me neither. He chuckled softly, trying to break the silence. It was my wife's. She taught kids. The music kind, not the math kind. Maisie tilted her head slightly, as if to acknowledge the information, but didn't speak. Dean led her to the guest room, modest, cleaned the bed, made with flannel sheets and a worn quilt. She sat on the edge but didn't take off her shoes. He crouched down beside her. You can stay here as long as you need, okay? It's not fancy. The walls creak when the heater kicks in, and the bathroom sink takes a minute to warm up, but no one's going to bother you here. She stared at him for a moment, and then, in a voice barely audible, asked, Do you lock your office? Dean blinked. Not usually. Why? She shrugged. Just wondering. He should have brushed it off, should have smiled and said something light. But instead, something inside him stirred. That whisper at the parade, the red light, the way Vivian had smiled too quickly when he mentioned it. Maisie lay back on the bed without another word. Dean quietly closed the door behind him. Later that night, after Vivian had gone home, and the house settled into stillness, Dean sat at the kitchen table, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee. The storm had passed, but the unease hadn't. He opened his laptop, something he hadn't done in weeks, and pulled up the router admin panel. The screen flickered to life. Devices connected his phone, his laptop, the smart TV, and one device he didn't recognize. Kitchen speaker. It was labeled like that, except he didn't own a smart speaker. He frowned, clicked deeper. The MAC address was unfamiliar, but it had been online regularly, always during times when he wasn't home. Or when he was sleeping. Dean's stomach tightened. He rose from his chair and walked slowly to the living room, scanning every shelf and corner. The chimes of the old grandfather clock ticked steadily behind him. Everything looked normal except the potted orchid on the side table. It wasn't his. Vivian had brought it, he remembered, as a housewarming gift a few months back. He bent over, brushing his fingers through the soil until he felt it. Cold, metallic. He pulled out a coin-sized device, tiny LED, blinking faintly red. For a moment, the house seemed to hold its breath. He turned the device in his palm. Jaw tightening. He should have been angry, should have yelled, called someone. Instead, he felt hollow. Cold. Maisie had been right. Again. The next morning, Maisie was already sitting at the kitchen table when Dean came downstairs. Her feet didn't reach the floor, but she sat with perfect posture, hands folded, as if preparing for something official. Dean set the device down in front of her. She didn't flinch. "I thought you might want to know," he said softly. Maisie looked at it, then at him. "Did you tell her yet?" "Will you?" Dean pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "Why did you tell me at the parade?" She shrugged. "No one believes kids when they talk. But sometimes, if you whisper, they listen harder." Dean let that sit in the air between them. Her eyes weren't accusatory, just observant. Patient, even. "I should have listened sooner," he said. "I didn't want it to be true. Vivian, she's been helping me with something important. Something that could change a lot for me and for you, too. But that doesn't make it right." Maisie looked down at her hands. "Sometimes people are good at pretending." He nodded. "Yeah, they are." Silence again, but this time it didn't feel as heavy. "You hungry?" he asked. She nodded. He stood, rummaged through the fridge. "I make terrible pancakes, decent eggs, and world-class toast." Maisie tilted her head. "What makes toast world-class?" Dean grinned. A generous application of butter and the correct level of regret. A pause. Then a small sound barely there. Maisie had laughed. Just once. But it was real. Dean turned back to the counter, and something in his chest loosened. Maybe just a little. Maybe just enough. Dean Holloway never thought he'd be taking technology advice from an 8-year-old. But that evening, after Maisie had curled up on the living room rug with a library book, too advanced for most middle schoolers, Dean sat at his workbench in the garage laptop. Open router logs splayed out on screen, and he was trying to see the world through her eyes. The device he'd found in the orchid pot was real. Tangible. There was no arguing with that. What he didn't know, what he couldn't quite bring himself to believe, was the implication that Vivian, the woman he'd let into his life after so much loss, had put it there. He wanted another explanation, something benign, something technical, a test, a glitch, a mistake. But he'd spent too many years writing security code not to recognize a planted bug when he saw one. He'd taught others how to spot them. Now he was the fool who hadn't. He leaned back and exhaled. The walls of the garage smelled faintly of oil and cedar. His late wife had always wanted to turn this space into an art studio. Instead, it had become a graveyard of unfinished projects and things he couldn't quite part with. A dusty toolbox, an unused telescope, a broken camera that no longer took pictures, but somehow still remembered every photograph. He clicked back to the device's access log. It had transmitted short bursts of data 3 times a week, always in the early hours of the morning, always to the same remote IP address. The server was masked and encrypted behind layers of fake names and phantom companies, but Dean had taught himself how to peel back those masks years ago. 30 minutes later, he had a name. Onyx Veil Solutions. The name meant nothing at first. Then it clicked. It was the consultancy firm Vivian said she used to work for. She'd mentioned it once over dinner, almost in passing. At the time, he hadn't thought twice about it. But now he saw shadows, where once there'd been light. The next day, Dean sat in his truck outside Vivian's townhouse. The engine was off keys dangling from his fingers. He could see her silhouette through the curtain, moving gracefully through the kitchen, pouring coffee into the blue mug he had bought her in Charleston. He had brought the bug with him. It sat in a plastic sandwich bag on the passenger seat next to his phone, and a post-it note with 2 sentences written in block print. Maisie was right. You lied. But he didn't move. His hand tightened around the steering wheel. He thought of her smile, her laugh, the way she had once fallen asleep with her head on his shoulder during a rainstorm. He thought of how she had brought Maisie a new backpack before even meeting her, how she had said she was excited to help him be a father again. Had that all been calculated? Had any of it been real? A knock on the driver's side window startled him. He turned to find Mr. Lionel Hayes, his quiet, silver-haired neighbor and part-time handyman, peering in with an inquisitive look. Dean rolled the window down. "Morning." "You've been sitting here for a good 15 minutes, Lionel said, not unkindly. "You waiting for a sign from heaven, or just rehearsing what to say?" Dean half laughed, half sighed. Somewhere in between. Lionel tapped the roof of the truck. "Come by my porch later. I've got something you might want to see." Before Dean could ask what the old man had already turned and started hobbling back toward his house, cane clicking against the pavement. Dean looked once more toward Vivian's window. The curtain had shifted. He turned the key in the ignition and drove away. That afternoon, Dean found Lionel sitting on his porch with a thick folder and a cold root beer. "I worked IT security for over 30 years, Lionel said, handing over the folder. "Back when encryption was still something you did with padlocks." Dean opened the folder and saw pages of logs, device ID numbers, printouts of screenshots and notes in tiny, meticulous handwriting. "I've been watching that house across the street," Lionel continued. Something didn't smell right. She had someone come by once a week. Same car, same guy. Never stayed more than 10 minutes. Didn't wear a uniform. Always left with a briefcase. "Why didn't you say anything?" Dean asked. "You didn't look ready to believe it," Lionel said simply. "But the girl, that one's sharp. She's not scared of the truth. And now it seems neither are you." Dean sat down heavily on the porch swing. "I wanted to build something again," he murmured. "Not code. Something human. Something that lasts." "You still can," Lionel said. "But not with someone building firewalls between you and the truth." That night, Dean and Maisie sat at the kitchen table, 2 bowls of tomato soup between them. She looked up from her spoon and said quietly, "I checked the IP address again." Dean raised an eyebrow. "You did, huh?" She nodded. "It pinged another device in your bedroom. The lamp." Dean exhaled through his nose. "You ever consider going into federal cybersecurity?" Maisie smiled faintly. "Maybe," he set his spoon down. "Maisie, I'm sorry I didn't believe you. I should have listened better. Trusted you sooner." Her face softened, and for the first time, she looked more like a child than a small soldier. "It's okay," she said. "Sometimes grown-ups just need more time." Dean reached across the table and gently tapped her knuckles. "I'm not going to let her hurt either of us," he said. "Not again." Maisie nodded, her eyes steady. "I know." And just like that, something unspoken settled between them, trust fragile but real, finally beginning to grow. The next morning brought an unusual stillness to the house on Burgundy Street, a kind of hushed anticipation that hung in the air like the silence before a courtroom verdict. Dean Holloway stood in his bedroom, holding the lamp in both hands. Maisie had been right again. Hidden beneath the base taped behind the felt pad was another small black device, identical to the one from the orchid pot. Its red light blinked once every 10 seconds. He should have felt rage, but all he felt was tired. He sat on the edge of the bed, letting the lamp rest beside him. Across the hall, he could hear Maisie humming softly, piecing together a puzzle she'd found in the closet. It was missing 3 edge pieces, but she didn't complain. She just adjusted to what she had. Dean rubbed his face. He hadn't slept well. Not because of the bugs, though those were bad enough, but because of the moment that had passed between them at the kitchen table the night before. When she said, "Sometimes grown-ups just need more time," she wasn't being clever. She was being gracious. He didn't deserve it. That afternoon, Dean stopped by Mr. Lionel Hayes's porch again. The old man had a kettle of sweet tea steeping beside him, and a yellow notepad in his lap, half filled with looping scrawl and diagrams. 3 devices now, Lionel asked without looking up. Dean nodded. 1 in the orchid, 1 in my bedroom lamp, and I just found another in the vent above my office desk. Lionel let out a low whistle. She wasn't just watching, she was archiving. That's layered surveillance. Someone's got a long game. Dean leaned on the porch railing. Do you think she planted them herself? Maybe. Maybe she had help. Depends how clean the install was. But either way, she knew. He paused, then added, "You don't plant devices like that unless you're expecting something big, something worth recording." Dean looked out across the street toward Vivian's townhouse. The shutters were closed, the front door, as always, perfectly painted. But behind that facade, something had been waiting. I think it has to do with the algorithm, Dean said. Lionel's eyes flicked up. You mean the one she said investors wanted? Dean nodded. It was something I'd been refining years ago, an authentication matrix that adapts with use. It's fast, quiet, nearly invisible. Perfect for secure communication, and nearly perfect for stealing. Lionel muttered. Dean exhaled. She offered to help resurrect the pitch, said she'd connect me with her old contacts. But what if this was about gaining access the whole time? Lionel folded his arms. She knew you wouldn't trust her if she asked outright, so she earned your heart first. Dean flinched. The truth landed sharper than expected. That night after dinner, Dean found Maisie in the hallway, kneeling beside the utility closet. You okay? He asked. She turned to him, face serious. The lock's broken. It's never locked, he said. Why, Maisie tapped the frame with her knuckle. Vivian went in here once. After you were asleep, I pretended I didn't see. But she had a screwdriver in her hand. Dean's stomach tightened. He opened the door slowly. Inside, among the usual coils of extension cords and old smoke detectors, was the main cable hub for the house's internet system. And tucked into the bottom corner, almost hidden behind a false backing, was a relay booster about the size of a deck of cards. He held it in his hand for a long time. Maisie watched him, but said nothing. Then slowly, Dean knelt down to her level. Maisie. I think I owe you more than an apology. She tilted her head slightly. Waiting. I think you've been protecting me from the beginning, and I didn't want to see it. I didn't want to believe that someone I trusted could hurt us. Maisie's expression didn't change, but her eyes shimmered. I wasn't protecting you, she whispered. I just didn't want you to be alone again. Dean's throat tightened. For a moment, the hallway felt like a cathedral, holding a kind of sacred silence. He nodded, unable to speak. Maisie leaned forward and wrapped her arms around his neck. It was the first time she'd initiated a hug. and it undid him completely. Later that night, Dean placed all 4 discovered devices on the dining room table in a straight line. 4 blinking red eyes, now powerless and silent. He took out a clean sheet of paper and began to write. Not code, not algorithms, but a plan. If Vivian had gone this far to spy, she wasn't working alone. Someone else was behind this. Someone who wanted the algorithm bad enough to orchestrate an emotional con job over months. But she had made one mistake. She underestimated the girl who noticed everything, and the man who finally started listening. Dean Holloway stared at the blinking red devices lined up on his dining table, their tiny lights pulsing like warnings in the dark. In the quiet hum of the house, they reminded him of something he used to teach new hires when he worked in cybersecurity. The most dangerous breach doesn't announce itself. It whispers. It waits. It smiles. Vivian had smiled. Often. He pushed away from the table and stood the creaking floorboard beneath his heel, grounding him back in the present. Maisie was upstairs asleep, or at least trying to be. She hadn't said much after their hug in the hallway, but she didn't need to. The truth had already shifted between them. She was no longer just a child in his care. She was his mirror, his reminder, his redemption. Dean walked to his office. He hadn't stepped into that room in weeks. The door groaned as it opened the same way it always had, only now he heard it differently, like a question finally demanding an answer. He turned on the lamp, sat down at his desk, and powered up the workstation. The algorithm Helix 3 was still there, tucked away in a folder labeled Archive under layers of encryption only he could unlock. It had taken him years to design. It wasn't flashy or marketable like what the venture capitalists liked, but it was secure, elegant, nearly unbreakable. Vivian had once said it was too good to stay buried. Now he wondered if she had ever admired it at all, or if it had simply been a target. Dean opened the most recent project file and began running diagnostics. Everything looked untouched, untampered. But the fact that Vivian had planted recording devices around the house, especially near his workstation, meant someone had likely been watching his keystrokes, monitoring his process. Piecing it together in silence, he felt cold, violated, and stupid. He closed the program and stared at the screensaver spinning lazily across the monitor. Then he leaned back, folded his hands, and let the anger come not as an explosion, but as a slow, bitter ache in his ribs. The next morning, Vivian came over. She arrived with a smile and a croissant bag from the French bakery on Royal Street, like nothing was wrong. Like their life was exactly as it had always been. Dean opened the door, let her in, and waited. "Coffee?" she asked, setting the bag on the counter. "I already made some," he replied, voice flat. She poured herself a cup and turned eyes scanning his face. "You okay?" Dean hesitated. Then, "You ever lie to someone because you thought they couldn't handle the truth?" Vivian smiled lightly. "Is this about Maisie again?" Dean studied her for a moment. "Maybe." She took a sip. "I told you, Dean. I know she's been through a lot, but you can't let every whisper get to you. Children want attention. They make up things to feel seen." His jaw tightened. He wanted to say. It wanted to lay out every device, every log file, every moment of her betrayal. But something in him held back. Instead, he asked, "Tell me again about your old job." Vivian blinked. "What you said you used to work with Onyx Veil Solutions. Consulting." "What kind of consulting?" She smiled. "Mostly financial restructuring." "Why and nothing technical?" "No, that was your world, not mine." Dean nodded slowly. "Funny, because one of the devices I found is broadcasting to an encrypted server owned by Onyx Veil." The room froze. Vivian's face didn't change, not exactly, but something behind her eyes flickered. A beat of silence passed. Then she set her cup down with precision. "What exactly are you accusing me of?" "I'm not accusing," Dean said quietly. "I'm telling you what I found. Devices, transmissions, patterns that lead back to you. She stepped forward, her voice now tight. You think I planted bugs in your home that I'm spying on you? I think someone wanted access to. Helix, Dean said. And I think they used someone I trusted to get it. Vivian's expression broke just for a second, a tremble in her bottom lip. Then she straightened. You think this is easy for me? You think I wanted this, she snapped. You were a ghost when I met you, a man building walls out of grief. I came in. I helped you live again. I opened doors. You had locked shut for years. You opened more than that, Dean replied evenly. Vivian's shoulders dropped. For the first time she looked tired, human, worn. Dean, I swear to you, I didn't know they were going to use you like this. It wasn't supposed to go this far. So she had known. Dean took a breath. What were you supposed to do, Vivian? She looked at him, eyes brimming. Just get close. Just help bring you back into the light. They said you'd never willingly revisit the algorithm, that it died with your wife. But if you started rebuilding it, if you felt purpose again, you might finally see the value. And you did. Dean stepped back, stunned. So everything, the dinner nights, the long walks, the way you looked at me, was that all part of it? She cried. Not at first. Not later. Maisie warned me. Vivian closed her eyes. She's smart. Smarter than any of us gave her credit for. Dean folded his arms. You need to go now. Vivian didn't argue. She picked up her bag, hesitated at the door, and then turned back. I didn't plan on loving you, she said. But I did. And I still do. Then she was gone. That night, Dean sat beside Maisie on the porch steps, a blanket wrapped around their shoulders. The stars above New Orleans were dim against the city lights, but still there. Quiet, constant, stubborn in their own small way. Maisie rested her head on his arm. Is she coming back? Dean shook his head. I don't think so. Maisie was quiet for a long moment. Then she whispered, Are you okay? Dean thought about it, thought about trust and betrayal and the cost of hope. Then he looked down at her. This little girl who had whispered truth into the ear of a man who didn't want to hear it. I am now, he said. For the first time in weeks, the house felt still. Not tense, not uncertain, just still. Dean Holloway stood at the kitchen window watching the sun climb over the rooftops. New Orleans was waking slowly, the sleepy rhythm of a Sunday morning, humming in the distance. Church bells, faint the occasional bark of a dog, the soft clink of dishes from the neighbor's porch. He held a mug of black coffee in both hands. Maisie was upstairs, still asleep. Her door cracked open just slightly. It was a small thing, such a small thing. But Dean noticed it. She was starting to trust the house again. Maybe even him. He walked into the office and stood in the doorway staring at the desk. The lamp. The empty orchid pot. The wires he had finally cut. No blinking lights now. No bugs. Just silence. And wood and memory. The echo of her voice still lingered. It wasn't supposed to go this far. He hadn't touched Helix since Vivian left. The algorithm, his life's work, remained zipped, encrypted, untouched. For days now, he had wondered whether to delete it completely. Bury it where it could never hurt anyone again. But that morning, something shifted. He sat down, powered up the system, and began typing. Not because he wanted revenge, not because he needed to win, but because he refused to let fear of betrayal, of mistakes, of starting over, dictate what came next. By noon, Maisie was downstairs, curled into the worn armchair with her ever-present notebook. She was sketching circuits. Again. Dean raised an eyebrow. Another design. She nodded without looking up. Hypothetical network separation for secure home use. Low grade but unbreachable, unless the attacker has physical access. Dean blinked. "You're 8. She finally looked up. "And you're late." "Late for what?" "For letting me help." He laughed, actually laughed at that. "You think I need your help? I think you needed it a long time ago." Dean walked over, crouched beside her. "I'm thinking about going public with Helix. Not selling it. Not licensing it. Just open source." Maisie tilted her head. "Why?" "Because if they already tried to steal it, they'll keep trying. But if I give it away freely, it becomes worthless to them and valuable to everyone else." She considered that. "It's a good idea." Dean smirked. "That sounds like approval." Maisie smiled faintly. "It's better than letting it rot. Or hiding." There was no bitterness in her voice, just observation, as if she saw not just what was, but what could be. Dean tapped the edge of her notebook. "I want you to help me code the interface." Maisie blinked, surprised. "Me?" "You," he said. "I've seen the way you think. And besides, who better to help build something secure than someone who actually pays attention?" She beamed. That afternoon, Mr. Lionel Hayes arrived with a bag of old tech parts and a box labeled retired, but not expired. "Thought you two might need a little reinforcement," he said, stepping into the office with a knowing grin. Maisie opened the box like it was Christmas morning. Inside, a set of unused microprocessors, a disassembled security cam, and a stack of ancient floppy disks wrapped in a rubber band. "I'm not saying they're still useful." Lionel shrugged, "but I figured you could teach her a little history." Dean smiled. "You're becoming suspiciously indispensable, Lionel. Only suspicious to people with secrets." They worked together for hours, Dean and Maisie at the desk, Lionel reading schematics aloud like bedtime stories. The office no longer felt haunted. It felt lived in, like a lab, like a home. At one point, Maisie paused, pencil midair. Dean looked up. "What is it?" She hesitated. "Then I think I want to stay." Dean's heart kicked. Maisie's eyes were wide, but steady. "Not just for a little while. I mean, really stay." Dean swallowed hard. He hadn't brought it up again since the incident with Vivian. There had been paperwork in motion discussions with Ms. Delaney, but he hadn't dared hope too loudly. "You sure about that?" he asked softly. Maisie nodded. "You're not perfect," she said. "But you listen now. And you let me be me." Dean chuckled, voice rough. "High praise." She leaned over and squeezed his hand. He didn't know how long he sat there staring at their joined fingers. But in that quiet, he heard something he hadn't felt in years. Belonging. That evening, just as they were finishing dinner, the doorbell rang. Dean tensed. Maisie looked up from her plate. He walked to the front door and opened it. Vivian stood on the porch, dressed in dark jeans and a coat hair pulled back. No smile, no performance, just her quiet, composed, and holding a small envelope in her hand. "I'm not here to fix anything," she said before he could speak. "And I'm not here to ask for forgiveness. I just wanted to give you this." She handed him the envelope. "It's everything I could get. Internal memos, server logs, copies of communication between Onyx Vale and their investors, including the names of the people who ordered the surveillance." Dean stared at her. "Why are you doing this?" "Because you didn't deserve what happened," she said. And because she didn't either. Her eyes flicked toward the window. Maisie had come into view, standing at the end of the hallway watching. "I don't expect anything," Vivian said. "Just, maybe someday you'll believe I meant some of it." Dean nodded once. "I already do. That's what makes it harder." Vivian stepped back. "Goodbye, Dean." She turned and walked into the night. He stood there long after the porch light blinked on the envelope, growing warm in his hands. Later, Dean sat beside Maisie again, this time at the foot of her bed, as she flipped through her sketchbook. She didn't ask who had come to the door. She didn't need to. Instead, she pointed to a page and said, "That one's called Echo Lock. It shuts off power to any device the moment it senses a security breach." Dean grinned, like a trapdoor for technology. Maisie smiled. Exactly. He leaned back against the headboard. For the first time, the house felt like it belonged to them both. Not a shelter, not a stopgap, but a beginning. And in the hush of her room, in the quiet of repaired trust, he heard it again. Not the echo of betrayal, but the first notes of something new. Dean Holloway stood in the center of the living room, a cup of coffee cooling in his hand, staring down at a structure that to the untrained eye looked like a chaotic pile of colored plastic. To Maisie, it was architecture. To Dean, it was brilliance in disguise. The Lego build stood nearly a foot high on the coffee table, a square base, thick walls, little towers, with blocky protrusions that at first seemed decorative. But if you looked closely, they mirrored a logic flow. Color-coded layers marked sequences. The red bricks weren't just accents, they represented fail-safes. The green were data verification routes. The blues marked encrypted handshakes. The whole thing was code. Physical code. He let out a low whistle. You built an encryption sequence out of Legos. Maisie looked up from where she was crouched on the floor, proudly rearranging the yellow bricks that formed a crude firewall. I built a decoy, she said. It looks like Helix, but it's not. It's just convincing enough to fool someone who doesn't know how to ask the right questions. Dean sat on the edge of the couch, eyebrows raised. This is what you think about after homework. She shrugged. It was either this or reading more about dead presidents. He smiled, but it faded quickly. We might actually need this. Maisie blinked. You're going to bait them. Dean hesitated, then nodded. I'm not going to wait for them to come back into our lives in the shadows. I want to control the conversation. The way forward. Maisie tilted her head. But if they know it's fake, they won't, he said. Because you made it. And they still underestimate you. That evening, Dean began rebuilding his presentation deck. Not the algorithm itself, but a front, a performance. A way to draw out the people behind Onyx Veil without giving them access to anything real. Vivian's documents had named names. One of them was a former investor Dean vaguely remembered from a failed pitch years ago, a man named Grant DeWitt, known in private circles as a corporate opportunist, with few morals and even fewer scruples. DeWitt had likely sent Vivian to play the long game. And now, Dean was going to turn the board. 2 days later, in a private tech conference at a boutique hotel just outside Baton Rouge, Dean Holloway took the stage. The room wasn't large, 30 seats, mostly filled with venture capitalists and private security consultants. Dean scanned the faces and saw him Grant DeWitt. Well-groomed, slightly smug, seated in the center of the second row. Perfect. Dean took a breath and clicked to the first slide. Good afternoon. Today I want to introduce you to something I call Helix 3.0. A murmur of interest rolled through the room. He gestured to the screen where the digital rendering of Maisie's Lego design spun slowly in 3D animation. This framework is self-correcting, scalable, and designed to blend into any secure system with virtually no operational drag. What you're seeing is a live model of the architecture. DeWitt leaned forward slightly. Dean went on speaking in confident but measured tones, using just enough jargon to sound proprietary, without actually giving anything away. As I'm sure some of you are aware, he continued, there's been interest in this model from certain unnamed parties. And in light of recent data misappropriation attempts, I've decided to offer this project to the open source community. A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd. DeWitt's expression stiffened. Dean smiled calmly. What that means, gentlemen and ladies, is that no one owns Helix 3.0. Not me. Not a board, not a private buyer. It's now free to the world, the real version, that is. He let that sit for a moment. But today, you're not here for the real version. You're here for the decoy, the one you tried to steal. Gasps. Silence. Dean clicked to the next slide. On the screen appeared the exact structure Maisie had built. But now each layer was labeled false authentication, fake logic. Gates mimicked timing sequences. Every section had been constructed to appear real until examined up close. I hope the people who tried to lift this from my home are watching, Dean said, because they wasted a lot of time chasing a toy. Back home, Maisie and Lionel sat on the couch watching the live stream. Lionel chuckled softly. He really said it. Maisie beamed. I told you he would. You built that whole thing, Lionel asked, gesturing to the model on screen. She nodded. It's not perfect, but it's enough. Lionel reached over and gently squeezed her shoulder. You just changed the game, kid. After the conference, Dean stepped off stage to a mix of confusion, admiration, and whispered conversations. He ignored the reporters, the stunned silence, the occasional glances from DeWitt. He walked straight outside into the cool Louisiana dusk and exhaled. Vivian was waiting near the curb. I watched, she said. You were bold. Dean shrugged. Someone had to be. She reached into her coat pocket and handed him a flash drive. Final logs, locations, proof that they paid me how they paid me. My name's in there too. He took it without a word. I'm leaving New Orleans, she added. He nodded. I just hope she forgives me someday. Dean looked at her steady. She already forgave you more than you deserved. Vivian's eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. She turned and walked away without another word. That night, Dean returned home to find Maisie asleep on the couch, Lionel snoring softly in the armchair beside her. The Legos still stood proudly on the table untouched. Dean knelt beside them and stared at the structure. The code, the decoy that saved them. It was in every way a work of genius. But more than that, it was a reminder that trust once shattered could still be repurposed. Rebuilt. Brick by brick. Dean Holloway stood behind the curtain, hands folded tightly in front of him, as the final round of applause faded beneath the golden lights of the small university auditorium. What had started as a quiet, almost defiant presentation at a private conference had caught fire. His video calling out the attempted theft of Helix 3.0, revealing the decoy Maisie built, and declaring the algorithm open source had gone viral in the tech community within 48 hours. But this was something else. Tonight wasn't for investors or reporters or opportunists. Tonight was for students. For kids who'd been told their ideas weren't worth much until someone in a suit said otherwise. For anyone who'd ever whispered the truth and been told to sit down. Dean adjusted the lapel of his jacket and looked at the girl standing beside him. Maisie was in a navy cardigan and canvas sneakers, a small mic clipped to her collar. She was quiet, but she wasn't nervous. She never had been, really. She just calculated. Still, thoughtful. He smiled. You ready? Maisie nodded. Let's bring down the house. On stage, the MC introduced them to the audience of high school robotics clubs, college programming majors, and a few curious professors in thick glasses and creased shirts. Dean stepped forward first. Thanks for having us, he began. Voice even. My name's Dean Holloway. I used to write algorithms for a living. Then I tried to hide from everything that hurt. And somewhere in between, I almost lost the best idea I ever had. Not the code, but the people around it. He turned to Maisie, who stepped up beside him. This is Maisie Ray, he continued. She's 8, and she outsmarted me. Laughter from the crowd. Genuine. Maisie smiled politely, then gestured toward the projected image of the Lego model on the screen behind them. "I built this," she said. "It's a fake version of something real. It's also a message. Not everything that looks advanced is smart, and not everything that looks simple is weak." There was silence for a moment. Then someone clapped. Then more. Dean watched her eyes glassy. She was in her element, and this was her moment. After the event, students crowded around them. Some asked about the algorithm. Some wanted selfies with Maisie. One girl in a wheelchair with pink hair whispered to her, "You made me feel like I can build things too." Maisie didn't say much, but she squeezed the girl's hand. Dean stood to the side and watched it all unfold. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was trying to fix something. He felt like something had healed fully, finally, and forever. Back at the house that night, the living room was warm with the smell of kettle popcorn and Lionel's cologne. The old man had insisted on babysitting their neighbor's pug for the weekend and was currently passed out in the armchair with the dog snoring atop his chest. Maisie curled under a blanket, legs tucked beside her, as Dean carried 2 mugs of cocoa from the kitchen. "You didn't just bring down the house," he said, handing her a mug. "You rewired it." Maisie smiled, eyes twinkling. "You were good, too." "I rehearsed. You didn't have to. You told the truth. That's enough." Dean sat beside her. "You think the truth always wins," Maisie shrugged. "I think it has better odds when someone listens." Dean leaned back, exhaled. "You've changed me." Maisie didn't respond immediately. Then softly, "You let me." The next morning brought a surprise. A letter from the court. Dean opened it with steady hands. Inside a single page, confirmation of permanent guardianship. His name. Maisie's name. A stamped seal. Legal. Official. Undeniable. He didn't cry. He just walked into the kitchen, folded the letter carefully, and placed it under the magnet on the fridge. Then he turned to find Maisie standing in the doorway. She looked at him, then at the paper. Her face didn't change, but her eyes did. They lit up just a little. "You're stuck with me now," she said. Dean chuckled. "Best upgrade I've ever made." Maisie crossed the room and hugged him, this time tighter. Longer. No hesitation. And Dean held her, as if he had been waiting for this version of forever his entire life. That afternoon, Vivian called. He almost didn't pick up, but he did. Her voice was soft. "Careful." "I watched the event," she said. Maisie was extraordinary. "She is," Dean replied. "She always was." There was a pause. "I wanted to say thank you," she continued, "for not naming me publicly. You had every right." Dean was quiet for a moment. "I didn't want revenge. I wanted the truth to speak for itself." Vivian exhaled. "Well, it did." She hesitated. "I'm getting help, Dean. Not for redemption, for clarity." "I hope you find it," he said sincerely. Then gently he ended the call, and felt nothing but peace. That evening, they took a walk, Dean and Maisie, down to the riverfront. The city shimmered in twilight, the old lamps casting long golden reflections across the water. Street musicians played quiet jazz nearby, the tune winding into the cool air like memory. Maisie stopped by the railing and leaned forward. Dean stood beside her. "Do you think we'll ever be normal?" she asked suddenly. Dean looked out at the river. "I think normal is overrated," he said. "And besides what we've got, it's rare." Maisie thought for a second, then said, "Rare is okay, as long as it's real." Dean nodded. "It is." She reached out, hand finding his. They stood like that for a long time. No blinking lights, no whispers in the dark, just truth. And the quiet curtain of the past, finally falling. The letter from the court had made it official. But it was the way Maisie now left her bedroom door ajar at night, the way she asked Dean to taste her hot chocolate before she drank it, the way she began correcting his code, like she owned it. That was what made it real. Dean Holloway had a daughter, not by blood, by choice, and there was no force on earth he'd trade that choice for. 3 days after the auditorium event, Dean received an encrypted message in his secure inbox. It was unsigned, but familiar in tone. "We don't forget what you took. This isn't over." He read it twice, then he forwarded it to a federal contact Vivian had helped him connect with after her last call, part of her clarity, she'd said. A small gesture toward righting the wrongs she'd been a part of. That same night, a black SUV rolled down the block and stopped in front of the house across the street. Maisie was the first to notice. "Dean," she said from the living room voice, low but calm. "They're back." Dean stepped to the window. 2 men exited the vehicle, plainclothes but alert. One carried a folder, the other a laptop bag. They headed not toward his house, but toward Mr. Lionel Hayes's. He opened the front door just in time to hear Lionel chuckle from his porch. "You boys need better timing." "I was just about to bake something." The older man turned to Dean. "You mind taking Maisie for a bit, of course. Everything okay?" "Nothing a cup of coffee and a few facts can't fix," Lionel said. Then more quietly, "Tell your girl she did good. She kicked a hornet's nest that needed kicking." Dean nodded and led Maisie back inside. "She didn't seem worried," Maisie said. "She wasn't. Lionel's always 5 steps ahead." Maisie didn't reply. She walked over to the chessboard on the side table and moved a rook. "He taught me that move," she said. "The one that traps the queen before she knows she's in danger." Dean smiled. Smart man. He said the hardest part about winning is knowing when to stop attacking. Dean looked at her, surprised by the weight of her tone. "You thinking about Vivian?" he asked. Maisie nodded slowly. "I keep replaying it in my head," she said. "If I'd said something earlier, or louder, or if I'd ignored her altogether." "Maisie, none of this was your fault, I know," she replied, "but part of me wanted to hurt her back. Just a little." Dean sat beside her. "And did you?" Maisie hesitated. "No," he studied her. "That's what makes you strong, you know. Not that you saw through her, but that you didn't try to destroy her after." She looked up, her voice softer. "Do you think she ever really loved you?" Dean paused, then said quietly, "I think she tried, and I think some part of it was real. But love built on lies doesn't survive daylight." Maisie nodded. "I just didn't want to hate her. I still don't." Dean placed a hand on her shoulder. "Then don't." The next day, Dean and Maisie walked to the corner bookstore to drop off some donations. On their way back, they passed the small park near the riverfront. The benches were empty, except for a single figure seated at the far end. Vivian. Her coat was folded neatly in her lap. She looked thinner, tired. Her posture was no longer that of a woman trying to impress a room, but of someone waiting to be forgiven by no one in particular. Maisie stopped. "That's her." Dean followed her gaze, then said, "You don't have to." But Maisie had already stepped off the path. Vivian looked up as they approached. Surprise flickered across her face, but she stood. "I wasn't expecting," she began, but her voice caught. Maisie looked up at her. "I'm not mad." Vivian swallowed hard. "You have every right to be." "I'm not," Maisie repeated. "But I needed to see your face when you said sorry. Just once." Vivian's eyes filled. "I'm sorry. For everything. For making you doubt your instincts. For using your kindness." For Maisie held up a hand. "Just say it once." Vivian knelt to her eye level. "I'm sorry." Maisie studied her face, then nodded. "That's all she said. I hope you figure out who you are when no one's watching." Then she turned and walked back to Dean. He stood still, heart heavy with something that wasn't quite pain and wasn't quite peace. Vivian watched them go unmoving. Just before they rounded the corner, Maisie glanced back. Vivian raised a hand just once. Maisie didn't wave back, but she didn't look away either. That night, Maisie asked to light the old candle on the mantel, the one Dean's wife had once kept by her piano. Any occasion, he asked, striking a match. Maisie shrugged. Just felt like a night for remembering and letting go. Dean lit the wick. They sat together in the dim room, the soft flame flickering between them. "You know," he said, for someone who used to whisper, "you're surprisingly loud these days." Maisie smiled. "That's your fault." Dean raised his cocoa in a mock toast. "To the loud ones." Maisie clinked her mug against his. "To the ones who listen." Spring settled slowly into New Orleans, like a song softening at the end of its final verse. Azaleas bloomed along the wrought iron fences, and the air carried the scent of magnolia and river mist. The city, always humming, now pulsed with something gentler. And in a modest white house tucked between a shuttered bakery and an aging bookshop, Dean Holloway was rebuilding both his code and himself. Not from scratch, from truth. Maisie sat cross-legged on the floor of his office laptop, open fingers flying across the keys like she was born to do this. Dean sat beside her, chin in hand, watching her eyes scan the lines of code she'd written. "You know," he said, "there was a time when I thought firewalls and authentication layers were the only kind of protection that mattered." Maisie didn't look up. "And now I think it's people." She paused. "People can fail. They can." Dean agreed. "But they can also learn. Choose better. Stay." Maisie typed something quickly, then turned the screen toward him. "This is the patch I wrote for the Helix interface. It doesn't just block intrusions. It detects patterns of behavior before they become breaches." Dean blinked. "You're predicting intent," Maisie shrugged. "Learning to recognize what feels wrong even when nothing's broken yet." Dean looked at her, truly. Looked, and realized that this girl, his daughter, had taken everything that had happened, the betrayal, the spying, the doubts, and turned it into insight, into something that would help others. "You're not just smart," he said quietly. "You're extraordinary." Maisie smiled. "You're just figuring that out." Later that afternoon, Dean sat on the porch with Mr. Lionel Hayes, a chessboard between them, and 2 glasses of sweet tea, sweating in the Louisiana heat. Lionel moved his knight with the smug confidence of a man who'd waited years to spring a trap. "Admit it," he said. "She's outpaced you." Dean chuckled. "I admitted that the day she reprogrammed my printer using a cereal box and sarcasm." Lionel leaned back. "You know, when I met you, you were walking around like your story had ended. Eyes down, heart locked. I remember. But then came that whisper. And you listened." Dean studied the board. "It changed everything." "Most men don't," Lionel said. "They hear the whisper, but they dismiss it. They pretend it's the wind, or memory, or something not worth the trouble." Dean nodded. "I almost did. But you didn't. You chose to hear her, to believe her. That's what makes a father, Dean. Not biology, not paperwork, but choosing to listen even when it costs you everything." Dean looked out across the street where Maisie sat on the curb with 2 neighbor kids, showing them how to use a magnifying lens to burn a design into a scrap of wood. She was laughing, and she looked free. That night, Dean sat at the kitchen table polishing the last few touches on a full public release of Helix. The algorithm had been downloaded thousands of times, already tweaked and tested by developers around the world. But this final version, vetted by Maisie, patched with her predictive sequence, and signed off by Lionel after a slow 3-hour inspection, was different. It was honest, transparent, the work of a man who had nothing left to hide. Maisie walked in already in pajamas, her hair still damp from the bath. "Done?" she asked. Dean turned the laptop toward her. "Final commit." "You want to hit publish?" Maisie nodded and clicked. Just like that, Helix 3.0 was live. No patents, no trademarks, no secrets, just code and kindness and a little girl's clarity disguised in logic trees. The next morning, a letter arrived in a manila envelope with no return address. Inside a note typed in all caps. "You cost us more than you know, but you won't hear from us again." Below it, taped carefully, was a single Lego brick. Dean stared at it for a long time, then passed it to Maisie. She held it in her palm like it was the last page of a book. "They're not coming back?" she asked. Dean exhaled. "Not if they're smart." Maisie smiled faintly. "Then I guess we won." "No," Dean said. "We survived." "That's better." That afternoon, they returned to the community tech center Dean had helped revive. A small warehouse converted into a learning hub, soldering kits, stacked in clear bins, 3D printers humming along the walls, and kids gathered around laptops, asking real questions. Maisie led a coding workshop. She stood at the front, dry erase marker in hand, and wrote one sentence on the board: "Good code is a promise." Then she turned and said, "That means it should do exactly what you say it will, just like people." No one interrupted. No one laughed. They listened. Dean watched from the back hands in his pockets, heart full. She wasn't whispering anymore. She was leading. That evening back home, they stood in the backyard under a sky blooming with stars. Dean handed Maisie a small box. She opened it. Inside was a dog tag pendant, silver and simple. Engraved on one side, Maisie Ray Holloway, and on the other, the girl who saw what no one else did. Maisie looked up at him. "It's heavy." Dean smiled. "You've always carried more than most. I just figured now it should shine too." Maisie hugged him tightly, her arms wrapping around him with the kind of certainty that only came from being seen and believed. And in that moment, Dean knew he wasn't the man who saved her. She had saved him. By whispering, and by trusting that one day someone finally would listen. It was quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes from absence, but the kind that settles when everything is finally where it belongs. The house on Burgundy Street breathed with peace. The office hummed faintly with a background scan. The porch creaked under the morning sun. And in the kitchen, the scent of cinnamon toast drifted through the air like a small celebration. Dean Holloway stood barefoot at the stove, flipping the last slice of bread in the pan. He wasn't rushing. For once in his life, there was nowhere he'd rather be. Nothing pressing. No code to debug. No threats to defuse. No cameras blinking in the dark. Only today. And Maisie. She padded into the kitchen in her mismatched socks hair still half asleep and climbed into the seat at the counter without a word. Dean slid the plate in front of her. Toast as promised. Maisie yawned and blinked at it. "Is this your world-class toast again?" Dean nodded solemnly. "Patent pending." She took a bite, chewed thoughtfully, and gave a thumbs up. "Still a little too much cinnamon," she mumbled with her mouth full. Dean smirked. Perfection is a moving target. Later that morning, they returned to the old church near the edge of the quarter. The community center had hosted its final coding workshop of the season, and today they were unveiling the newly donated computer lab machines, paid for by quiet backers who'd seen the live stream of Dean and Maisie's talk. One of the computers had already been nicknamed the Whisper Terminal. Dean stood near the door hands in his pockets, watching Maisie help a group of kids navigate the login interface. She had a way of explaining things without talking down. She used simple language, clear images. But more than that, she looked them in the eye, listened before she spoke. A boy about 7 years old asked, "What if I mess it up?" Maisie leaned forward. "Then you try again. That's how we learn." He nodded but still hesitated. Maisie lowered her voice. "You know what I did wrong once I trusted someone I shouldn't have. But I learned how to trust myself again. The boy looked at her with the kind of silent reverence usually reserved for astronauts and superheroes. Dean swallowed hard. After the event, as the sun began to dip behind the church windows, Dean and Maisie sat alone in the sanctuary. The pews creaked softly under their weight. A beam of gold filtered through the stained glass, casting color across the stone floor. Maisie looked up at the altar, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think my birth parents would be proud?" Dean didn't answer right away. He followed her gaze to the colored light on the wall. "I think," he said, finally, "anyone who knew who you are and what you've done would be proud. Proud. And probably a little stunned." Maisie was quiet for a moment. "I don't remember their faces anymore. Not clearly. Just pieces." Dean placed a hand gently over hers. "You remember what matters." She nodded. "I remember waiting, listening for someone to care." She turned to him, eyes steady. "Then you came." Dean smiled, but it faltered around the edges. "I didn't always get it right." "But you listened," Maisie said. "That changed everything." He looked down at her. "You know I used to think whispers were small things. Easy to miss." Maisie tilted her head. "And now I think sometimes," Dean said, "they're the loudest truth of all." That evening, they returned home as the first drops of rain began tapping softly on the windows. The kind of rain that made you slow down, not rush. The kind of rain that asked for blankets and stories and soft voices. Maisie lit the candle on the mantel without needing to ask. Dean joined her on the couch, a thick quilt tossed over their legs. She leaned her head against his shoulder, warm and familiar, as if she had always belonged there. "I think this might be my favorite day," she said. Dean rested his chin lightly against her hair. What made it different, Maisie was quiet for a beat. "Because I didn't feel like I had to earn anything today. I just was." Dean closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of her words settle into his chest. He remembered the first time he'd seen her, small, scared, unsure. The whisper at the parade, the blinking light, the first suspicion, the first bond, the battle that followed, the choosing. And now this. She was no longer the girl who whispered warnings from the edge. She was the girl who had taught him to listen. A week later, on a clear Saturday morning, Dean stood beside the community mural downtown. It had started as a simple wall for kids to paint, freely, just color and chaos. But over time, it had turned into something intentional. A patch of blue circuit lines, a painted fingerprint made of gold, a candle flame, a girl's silhouette standing in front of a pixelated doorway. Maisie stood beside him with a paintbrush, eyes narrowed in concentration. "What do you want to add?" he asked. She dipped the brush into white paint and carefully began to write in the upper corner. "Some whispers aren't meant to be quiet forever." Dean read it, blinked slowly, and let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. That he said might be the most important code you've ever written. Maisie smiled and handed him the brush. "Your turn." Dean stared at the wall. Then below her line in the same white paint he added, "And some fathers are made the moment they finally listen." As they walked away from the wall hand in hand, the paint still drying behind them, Dean Holloway didn't feel like a man who had rebuilt his life. He felt like a man who had finally heard it. The whisper. The one that changed everything. If you've stayed with us to the very end, thank you. We hope this story touched something quiet and real in your heart, just like the whisper that changed Dean's life. We'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from today? Drop us a comment below. We read every single one. And if you enjoy stories that speak softly but stay with you long after, please consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications. That one small gesture helps us keep sharing the kind of stories that truly matter. From our hearts to yours, thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next story.